Okay, so welcome everyone to this Hayek Society event. I'm going to be chairing it rather than some LSE academic who will want to be doing that. And so just by means of introduction, we have Sean Gabb with us today, who is a writer, lecturer and broadcaster and director of the Libertarian Alliance. And so, as you know, Hayek Society, we try and keep good links with various libertarian organisations. We've got something planned with the Institute of Economic Affairs in a few weeks' time, so you'll be hearing about that. So it's good to add the LA to the list. Now, Sean is he's spoken and written on a number of topics, such as gay marriage, legalization of drugs, and of course freedom of speech, which I'll be speaking on today. So, without further ado, please take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your introduction, and thank you for having had the goodness to invite me to address the Hayek Society, for which I've always had the highest regard, and many thanks to the audience for having come out on an evening when apparently the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer is speaking at the LSE. I am very honoured that you think me more worthy of your attention. Now, 35 years ago, when I was your age as an undergraduate, my university or my students' union had a no platform policy in which persons who held disagreeable views were prevented, so far as possible, from speaking on campus, and certainly were prevented from speaking to any organisation that was connected with the students' union. Nowadays, I can see that we have progressed a long way from that no platform policy, insofar as I come before you without any particularly disagreeable views on the moral or intellectual fitness of certain human groups, or the propriety or advisability of certain lifestyles. I am simply here to argue that there should be no controls. There should be no legal controls on the expression of such opinions, and even so, it has been thought necessary for a member of staff to sit in on this meeting, with no sinister intent, I'm sure, simply to make sure that I do not say anything untoward. And there was even some vague talk about a disruption of the meeting. And so when I was your age 35 years ago, I naively thought that we were, broadly speaking, going in the right direction. Today I can see that whatever progress there has been in quite the wrong direction. With that introduction, let me begin. When I say that I believe in freedom of speech, I think I should define my terms. I believe that we have the right to say anything that is not in breach of some private right and does not tend towards the dissolution or overthrow of the country of which we are a citizen. Let me explain. I have no right to publish your private revelation to me of some personal unfitness. That would be a breach of confidence. I have no right to pass off an essay of yours that you show me as my own work. That would be a breach of your intellectual property. I have no right to tell the world that treasure beyond counting is buried 6 feet below your flower beds. That would be libel, perhaps, or slander, or malicious falsehood. Equally, I have no right to tell the world where our Trident submarines are located. If we are at war, I have no right to reveal to the world such knowledge as I may have of where our next big push will be. I have no right, if there is a reasonable prospect of war, to reveal what might be regarded as important military secrets to a foreign enemy. I accept that all of these restrictions on freedom of speech have been used as excuses to cover up various kinds of wrongdoing, and certainly where any law regarding state security is concerned, the law must be very tightly drafted and must be continuously policed, because that is the main source of trouble when it comes to restrictions on freedom of speech from central government. But so long as such laws are used only for their stated purpose, although I may disagree with the details of them, although I might wish there to be a much more liberal law of libel, we do have a pretty liberal one at the moment, I see no reason to complain that we live in a regime of censorship, so long as those exceptions are there to cover only the reasons used for their justification. I do not see any reason to complain unduly. Beyond that, however, everything else is fair game. Anything that is in the public domain is fair game for comment, one way or the other. There should be no legal restrictions. Nobody should be sent to prison for voicing a disagreeable opinion. Nobody should be sent to prison. Nobody should be punished in any administrative sense for saying anything that happens to offend a person or a group or any kind of interest. That is a reasonable working definition of freedom of speech. Not a radical definition, I will agree, but it is a working definition. Why do I think that freedom of speech is so important? I could go into a long exposition of the non-aggression principle, or talk about our inalienable human right, or our inalienable right to speak our minds or use our property as we will. But I might just as easily talk about how God wants us to be free. If you don't believe in God, what I'm saying is effectively a verbal burp. And if you don't believe in inalienable rights, what I am saying will not really carry much weight. And so let us leave aside any questions of your absolute inalienable right to freedom of expression. Let us take a utilitarian approach to it. And one reason why freedom of speech is so important is that without freedom of speech, it is very hard to say that you know anything with reasonable surety outside your own limited sphere of inquiry. Let me begin with a useful and perhaps a neutral example. I believe that between 1917 and 1991, the Soviet state murdered around 30 million people. It murdered some of those people by shooting and hanging, and some of those people by deliberately engineered famines. It murdered them in various ways, but it brought about the deaths of around 30 million people. I believe this with reasonable surety. But how do I know that it happened? I wasn't there. So far as I can tell, the greatest volume of killings ended before I was born. I've never been there. If I had been to Russia, I wouldn't have seen any of the killings. How do I know that happened? I could look at the primary sources. I could look at the KGB archives, which were opened for quite a long period and which remain reasonably open to inquirers. But the point is, I don't speak any Russian, and I'm not, although I deplore the violence of the Soviet state, I'm not enormously interested to learn about its details. And so I don't speak Russian, and I don't want to read any of those primary sources which may have been translated into English. Indeed, although I don't speak any Russian, I am reasonably competent in Greek and Latin. And I can tell you from my own expertise that for the past 300 years, translations into English from Greek and Latin have systematically ignored the rather holistic attitude that the ancients took to sexuality, and have completely overlooked the strong partiality of both the Greeks and the Romans to mood-altering substances. If you choose one translation of a word over another translation of a word, you can change the entire meaning of the whole passage. And if you can do that in Greek and Latin, you can do it in Russian. And so even if I were inclined to go looking at the translations of primary sources, I would have no surety that I was reading the truth. The reason I believe that the murders of 30 million people by the Soviet state took place is because I read it in a book. And I believe what I read in that book, or those books, purely on authority. I am not able or inclined to go behind those authorities and look at any kind of primary evidence, partly because I don't want to, but partly because I can't. There is no shame in saying that I believe this on authority, because most of the things I know, in quotation marks, I believe on authority. I believe that the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. I believe that because when I was younger, I read it in a book about astronomy. For all I know, the speed of light might be infinite, or it might be 10 miles a second. I wouldn't notice the difference. I don't know how to measure the speed of light, and if I were told how to measure the speed of light, I wouldn't know how to use the necessary instrumentation. And if I did try to measure the instrumentation, I have no doubt that I would reach results so widely at variance that they became worthless. I don't know how to prove that the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. I believe it on authority. I believe that the Earth is an oblate sphere that rotates on its axis once every 24 hours. Now, I'm willing to accept the evidence of my uninstructed senses that the world appears to be a sphere. Rotating on its axis, I've never seen that. As far as I can see, everything is moving around a stationary Earth. And as for the flattening at the poles, search me, I wouldn't know how to prove that. And although I've said that the world appears to be a sphere, you put me up against a skilled and intelligent flat earther, and I would look like a right idiot in under 5 minutes. I do not know how to demonstrate that the Earth is not flat, or at least I do not know how to demonstrate that the Earth is not a sphere. And I could go through a whole list of things that I believe, but which I'm unable to demonstrate. I simply take on authority. And as I said, there is no shame in this. Of course, you should be careful not to accept too many things on authority when they are in your own sphere of interest. But for the most part, indeed, for the overwhelming bulk of the things you know, you take it on authority. And even if, to go back to the speed of light, even if you are able or inclined to look behind the claim of a certain speed, there's only so far back you will go. You will still reach a point, probably, where you are taking statements on authority. Let me return to the murderous activities of the Soviet state. What reason have I for believing that these things happened? The answer is that I am taking on authority a consensus among scholarly opinion which is openly reached and openly maintained. It is possible, it is legally possible, and it is in fact possible for anybody to stand up and say, no, The Soviet state did not murder 30 million people. Indeed, Christopher Hill, a rather distinguished, though perhaps eccentric, historian of 17th century England, maintained to the end of his life that this was simply propaganda put out by the Western powers to besmirch the noble socialist experiment of the Soviet Union, and that there were no killings. Eric Hobsbawm, an even more distinguished historian, though in my opinion a rather eccentric one, did not deny that there had been somewhat unpleasant activities within the Soviet Union, but always maintained that they were greatly exaggerated by Western propaganda. Barbara Castle, not a communist, indeed a Labour politician, and in the 1960s a Labour cabinet minister, was in Moscow in the late 1930s, and she maintained until her dying day that she did not see any evidence in Soviet Russia of the terror that we read about in history books. And so not only is it legally possible for anyone to challenge the scholarly consensus of a murderous Soviet state, but it has been done. I've given you 3 examples. And so this is a consensus openly reached and openly maintained and openly challenged, which still stands up. And for that reason, I am willing, as somebody who is unable or unwilling to look at the sources for himself, to accept the claim that the Soviet state murdered all those millions of people. If, on the other hand, it were to become an article of faith, breach of which was attended by imprisonment or loss of employment or expulsion from a place of learning, to uphold the truth of the murderous activities of the Soviet state, then I would feel much less confident than I presently am in maintaining that those murders took place. It may, of course, be that my confidence would be unshaken. After all, we have had a very long period during which the debate over the Soviet state has taken place, and opinion has been entirely free on these issues so far, and it is very unlikely that in the future there will be compelling new evidence discovered either way that adds to anything that is presently the consensus. It may well be that the truth is reasonably well known that the Soviet state did kill all those millions of people. It may have killed a few million more, a few million less, but the Soviet state was not a nice institution in the 20th century, and it may be that there will be no new evidence discovered to shake or to confirm that judgment. And so if it were to become illegal to discuss these murders now, it might be that my confidence in the statements I read in the history books would be unaffected. On the other hand, there would be people standing up and saying, what kind of truth is this that needs laws to defend it? If it's true, why can't it be denied? And so, to make it a criminal offence, or even to make it in administrative terms unwise to discuss certain issues, is to shake our confidence in the truth in those areas. And the greater the degree of censorship, the less certain can be the faith we have in any particular scholarly consensus. If there were anybody in this audience at the moment who was strongly in favour of censorship, the answer I would have is, oh, come on, Sean, we're not talking about shutting down debate on scientific or historical topics. We're talking about hate speech, the kind of hate that blasts people's lives, the kind of hate that whips up mobs to murderous frenzies. That's what we're talking about. Well, I don't think that is the case. So far as I can tell, the main arguments for censorship, certainly within universities at the moment, the main argument for censorship is to shut down debate on the allegedly differential moral and intellectual policies of certain groups, or about the rightness or advisability of certain lifestyles. And although you may find certain claims made in one direction or the other about these issues to be disagreeable, it remains true that there is no formal difference between claims about these issues and claims about what happened in the Soviet Union, or indeed claims about the speed of light. The arguments are still expressed in terms of propositions which are supported with various kinds of evidence. I go further on that. When people talk about hate speech, the idea that pops into my mind, and the idea that may be intended to pop into my mind and your mind, is the idea of somebody turning up outside a chess club, for example. You turn up outside a chess club at the head of a morgue, and you make a speech in the following terms. There are children. There are kidnapped children inside that chess club, inside that building at the moment. Little boys and girls as young as 2, they're being tortured. And in a minute, they'll be raped and murdered, and their bodies will be eaten. And so we must take action now. We must stop these evil people from killing those little children as young as 2. Well, if you do make such a speech, and there is a breach of the peace, then it is quite reasonable to regard you as criminally responsible, at least in part, for the damage to life and property that ensues. You have assembled people, you have harangued those people out of their right minds, you have told them that there is an emergency, you have to some extent subordinated their will to your own. And you should stand trial alongside those people. But this is not very often the case. Most of the people who are proceeded against for their opinions do not turn up outside buildings in public at the head of mobs, inciting people directly to violence. Most of the people who are proceeded against for what they say have written and published something. And that is an entirely different situation. If you read an article, and again I'm being extraordinarily reticent about the nature of the opinions that are forbidden. I'm doing this for your sake as well as for mine. If you read an article which talks about the allegedly differential moral and intellectual qualities of groups of human beings, you are sitting alone in a library with a journal article in front of you, or a book, or you are sitting somewhere else with a website open in front of you. You are reading this by yourself. Almost certainly the piece of writing before you will not tell you to go out and commit an act of violence against life or property. It'll be left to you to form your own judgment on that. You will go through some process of reflection, and then you'll have to get up and go out and commit an act of violence against life or property. In such a case, your will is what the lawyers call a new intervening cause. You are fully responsible for your own actions. And whoever wrote the article that may have inspired you to action cannot be held in any sense legally responsible, at any rate, for your actions. And so the idea that simply making such writings available, simply allowing people to turn up and speak their minds, is a direct cause of crimes against life and property is at the very least a misstatement. your own will, as I said, is a new intervening cause. And I go further. Let me be rather specific. It is reasonable to suppose that Mein Kampf and the collected speeches of Adolf Hitler inspired the murder of between 7 and 13 million people between 1933 and 1945. It seems a reasonable body count. That is a deplorably high number, and one can wish that Hitler had never been born or had stepped under a tram in Vienna circa 1910. But does that mean that we should ban the publication of Mein Kampf, or that we should insist on its removal from every university library in the country or indeed in Europe? Perhaps we should. But if we demand the banning of Mein Kampf, why not the banning of Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto? As I've said, the Marxian socialists of the 20th century murdered around 30 million people in the Soviet Union, and they murdered between 50 and 80 million people in China, and, well, you know, we're talking telephone numbers when it comes to the scale of death. For every person murdered by someone inspired by Mein Kampf, you can say 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, 15 times as many murdered by somebody inspired by one of the various works of Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels. Does that mean that we should ban the works of Karl Marx from every university library in the country, or in Europe, or in the world, wherever we have the ability to reach out and insist on these bans? I don't hear many people answering yes to that, not simply in this room, but in general. It seems to be rather a selective call for censorship. And there are many feminists who insist that rape equals porn. Now, I won't get involved in that debate, but let it be supposed that certain kinds of erotic writings and images may put things into people's minds that would not otherwise have been there. Yes, it might well do. But again, if we are to ban the publication of those images and words, why do we allow people free access to the works of Karl Marx and Lenin and all the others, whose works have, on exactly the same grounds, inspired hundreds or thousands of times more murders? I'll say again, the calls for censorship that I see do tend to be highly selective. You can extend the principle stated for censorship to cover all manner of things that are otherwise untouched. One moment, I'll pause for questions just a moment. The last point I would make, and I don't wish to go on and on all evening, so I'm going to wind up now. The last point I would make is that at the moment, many people are suggesting that a university campus should be a safe space, that persons from certain minority groups which have allegedly suffered a great deal of persecution in the recent past, or which still suffer a certain degree of persecution, should be protected. They should not be required to encounter opinions or attitudes that they find disagreeable. I accept that there are many opinions, quite often rather bluntly stated, which some people find offensive, which some people find hurtful. And I sympathise with those people, I feel sorry for them. But when you ask for a university to become a safe space within which people will be freed from the requirement to subject themselves to disagreeable opinions, you are arguing for something quite different from the traditional conception of a university, What you're arguing for is a nursery school, or a seminary, or some kind of monastic community. If you really are upset, if it causes spots to break out all over your face, or if it causes you to cut pieces out of your body in the manner of the late Princess of Wales, simply because you read an argument that, for example, here's one, because fat people allegedly break wind more often than thin people, they are contributing unacceptably to global warming. If encountering that sort of argument sends you into some kind of meltdown, you really shouldn't be in a university. You have no business being in a place like the London School of Economics. With all respect, and as I said, I will repeat again, some people are very upset by the things they read and hear, but if you're in a university, that's part of your education. And so for all of the reasons I've given, and doubtless for many reasons that I haven't given, I would say that there should be unlimited freedom of speech on all issues which are in the public domain, regardless of the embarrassment or the offence that these may cause to other persons. With those words, I will stop, and I'll thank you for the great indulgence that you've shown me.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we can just have some questions now. I've got some. I think Amrish is particularly keen to ask a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
With regard to selective censorship that you mentioned, I'm guessing most people agree with your point. I agree with your point. What do you think drives the selection of the things being censored? And related to that, why are so many people blindly / passively allowing such things to be censored without some sort of resistance or significant resistance?
What drives censorship? Well, there's no overall conspiracy. There's no shadowy group of people saying we will stop people from talking about this so that we can carry on robbing and exploiting and murdering at will. There are people who are unable to argue against the opinion they want to ban. And then there are other people who simply think it beneath their dignity to argue against what they would want to ban. And then there are other people who simply look at the precedent of one kind of banned speech and so expect that their own dignity as a minority group requires them to insist on censorship in their own, for their own cause. For example, I came across an argument a few years ago for hate speech against fat people to be made a criminal offence. Now there is no central organisation of fat people. It's just that if you're sick of being called, oh, you really let yourself go, haven't you? Don't have that. A moment on the hip, a moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips. If you really get sick of hearing that, you may look at the example, the precedents set by other groups and say, well, I'm sick of this. I think there should be a law against being rude to people like myself, persons of size, who's, it's not my fault that I'm perhaps a little on the ample side. I'm sick of this. I want a law against it. Why do people go along with this? Well, partly because it's too much trouble to stand up and say people should be allowed to say these disagreeable things, because the implication will often be that you believe in those disagreeable things yourself. During the witch mania in Europe during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, if you denied the existence of witches, you you could often be found guilty of witchcraft yourself. And although we don't burn witches anymore, people accused of heresy can be sent to prison, or at the very least they can be made untouchable in their various trades and callings. And to stand up and say that you know, John Smith shouldn't be put in prison for saying that, John Smith should not be kicked out of his university position for saying that, he should have the full right to freedom of speech. If you stand up and say that too loudly, there are people who say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He's that way inclined himself. So there is a climate of fear.
Okay, Will, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, just particularly as libertarians, how we should deal with distinctions between speech in the public sphere and a right to speech within private platforms, things like Twitter or Facebook. Because I know personally I will be very concerned when Twitter recently came out with a sort of trust and safety council to police the actions of its users. And there I feel as though something wrong and illiberal is happening in perhaps a million sense. But I struggle to articulate any kind of rights claim that would entitle me to free speech on Twitter. And instead I must fall back on a broader, it's just healthy to let everyone express their opinions argument. And is that the best that we can do, or what strategy should we take there?
It may well be the best thing that we can do. After all, I'm the director of the Libertarian Alliance. We have a blog. We post a diversity of things on it. But if you were to come to me with an article explaining that certain events in Central Europe in the 1930s and 40s didn't happen but should have happened, my answer would be, I don't propose to touch that with a 10-foot barge pole, take it somewhere else. Now, you know, what we're talking about is the use of private property. And as you say, by extension, as you say, Twitter and Facebook are private property. And if those organizations choose not to allow certain opinions to be voiced on their own private property, who are we to speak otherwise? It's just that they are so large and they are so ubiquitous. And it does sensibly diminish the scope of free debate if certain opinions are chased from those very important public places or those very important places. I suppose I could come out with a rather fanciful argument that Twitter and Facebook are joint stock limited liability corporations. They are granted certain privileges by the state in that the shareholders cannot be sued for tort, or they can't be chased in the event of a bankruptcy of the company itself. And in return for that, if they claim to be providing a platform for public debate, they should be required to provide a platform for public debate. But I wouldn't insist on that. I think I would agree with you that so far as Twitter and Facebook are constraining the bounds of debate at the moment, it is to be deplored, but it is by no means in the same league as a criminal law against the expression of certain views. It is simply deplorable.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I've got two questions. So the first one is, I would just agree and thank you for everything you said about the Soviet Union, because I think it's an argument that a comparison that needs to be made more often than it is when it comes to these kinds of debates. But just following on from that, I just wondered if you could comment on the fact that recently in Ukraine they have made it illegal to deny the Holodomor, which is precisely the kind of hunger famine you're speaking about. And I think it's quite easy to understand the motive which drives that, due to the fact that obviously between relations between Ukraine and Russia right now, and given the history, there seems to be this kind of extreme emotional desire to do that. And I think maybe it would be interesting to hear if you have any thoughts on that. And the second thing is that I was surprised to hear you say that this kind of opprobrium is not new. This has happened when you were a student, and this is because I assumed it was a new phenomenon on campuses. And recently I saw that apparently there was a question put in the LSCSU council in which somebody asked, would the LSCSU seek to ban a colour on campus if it was deemed to be offensive? And the answer, from what I understand, was yes. And so it seems to me like to maintain this kind of offence, it's an unsustainable project. But given that you suggest that this is not a new phenomenon among students, I wonder whether you think this is in fact a sustainable project of hysteria.
Every so often during my life, I've said, you know, this can't carry on much longer. But I've reached a somewhat advanced age in life, and these things have carried on. H.J. Isaac, who had a number of disagreeable things to say about the differential moral or intellectual qualities of various groups of human beings, turned up, I think, to the LSE in the late 1960s to speak about something else and was prevented by a student demonstration. And so this has been going on since my time as a student and since long before my time as a student. It has been going on now for a good half century, and there is no reason to suppose that it will not continue indefinitely into the future. As regards controls on freedom of speech in the Ukraine, this is a country without any particular liberal tradition. It is a country which is being torn apart, and which has to some extent been broken apart already by a civil war. It is a country in which elected representatives get involved in fistfights on camera in the Parliament building, and so if these people come out with laws to criminalise disagreement with the official view over events in the 1930s, I am not surprised, and I'm unable to feel inclined to distinguish that law for any special condemnation. We're talking about the kind of state of affairs that we would never wish to come about in this country. So that's a rather ambiguous answer, isn't it? It doesn't mean anything. Ukraine is a country that is falling apart. And when a country is visibly falling apart, it perhaps is unfair to single out any particular aspect of the country's dissolution. We should simply hope that it doesn't happen here. Sorry, is that a better answer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if there could be a kind of follow-up question, it would be: do you think that it's permissible to limit free expression legislatively in special circumstances? I mean, it's hard to see why criminalising beliefs that the Holodomor was not true or did not occur would actually help to sustain Ukraine in its fight against Russia. But suppose it did, would you consider that a legitimate restriction on expression in the same way that, for example, not revealing the location of private submarines is for security?
If you want to put it in those terms, if I were a Ukrainian patriot, and if I were reasonably assured that criminalising the denial of these facts would materially assist my country in preserving its independence, then you would have made a persuasive case. But we're talking about a set of circumstances so contingent that it doesn't affect the generality of what I've said, does it?
Okay. I'll come to Phil in a moment. I want to ask my own question first.
Sorry.
I wonder if you could comment on the kind of just building on from Amish's question about the selection of these of who to censor. The NUS recently have targeted people like Jermaine Greer and Peter Tatchell, who are kind of generally seen as of the left. I just wondered what you thought about that in terms of what you said about how they select who to censor generally based on their ideas. It seems now that that's kind of changing.
Well, I suppose what I ought to do is have a good laugh at it. I've always regarded Jermaine Greer and Peter Tatchell as foaming lefties, and to see these people turning on their own might bring a rather embittered belly laugh. But the problem is that although I've never met Jermaine Greer, I do know Peter Tatchell fairly well, And although I don't like his socialism, although I don't like his endorsement of anti-discrimination laws, although I think Peter is often rather excitable in the expression of his opinions, what I will not deny, what I will never deny, is that Peter Tatchell came out as a gay man at a time when to imply that you might be a bit that way inclined could get you a black eye. And Peter went on those marches, and Peter stood up and argued for decriminalising and for lowering the age of consent at a time when it would get you more than the occasional funny look. He did that, and although it's very hard to measure cause and effect between statements and changes in the law, he did, I believe, have a measurable effect on bringing about the relatively liberal environment within which persons of diverse sexuality nowadays live. And to see people who were not even born, and sometimes whose parents had not been born, at a time when Peter was going on those marches and being spat at, and being called transphobic and a racist and a bigot, strikes me as scandalous at the very least. Utterly scandalous. That aside, I am told that witch hunts generally diminish in further when sometimes the witch hunters themselves find themselves in the dock accused of untoward thoughts or actions. And although Peter and Germaine Greer have never been witch hunters as such, I do look forward to a time when the people leading these witch hunts will themselves be hunted. And perhaps that will be the end of the madness. But as I said, this has been going on now since the late 1960s at least. And I see no reason why it shouldn't continue for a very long time to come.
Okay, Phil, how are you happy to now?
Sure. Okay, with regards to organisations like ISIS, where would you draw the line when it comes to free speech? Would you draw the line in no platforming anyone who even sympathises with ISIS or putting them in prison, or would you draw the line when it comes to funding or recruiting for ISIS?
I certainly would not make it any kind of criminal offence to stand up and support ISIS. If you believe that Western civilization is a disgusting swamp, and that it is the right and duty of Muslims everywhere to stand up and strike a blow against Western imperialism in the lands of Islam and in the lands of the unbeliever, then I believe you have the right to say that. And should you have the right to raise money for ISIS? Probably not, because then you could be accused of procuring criminal acts. But should you have the right to leave this country and go and fight in Syria? Well, yes, I think you should. In the 1930s, many tens of thousands of British people left this country and went to Spain to fight on both sides in the civil war in that country. And they did so without breaking any law in this country, and they came back and they carried on with their lives, sometimes rather troublesome lives. And if British citizens want to leave this country to take part in a civil war, in which our own country is not involved, mind you, then I don't see why they shouldn't. Perhaps they shouldn't be allowed to come back, but that's another matter. But certainly, leaving aside participating in the Syrian civil war and leaving aside raising funds for acts of terrorism, leaving all those things aside and simply looking at the right to propagandize in favour of burning people to death and chopping heads off, then yes, that does come within freedom of speech, so long as you're not saying see that person there, John Smith, I believe that we should get hold of him, burn him to death. As long as you are not committing an assault, as it would be recognised by the common law, I think with some regret that you should be able to speak in favour of extreme violence in the abstract. No, not with any regret. You should have the right to speak in favour of extreme violence. Now, when I was your age, or rather when I was an undergraduate, there was an organisation at my university and at most universities in this country called the Irish Solidarity Campaign, a group of beastly IRA scumbag people. And they would always turn up to union meetings and speak about the war against British colonialism and the death in custody of political prisoners or prisoners of war. And my blood would boil at watching these people. But I never for a moment thought that they should be chased off campus or that they should be put in prison for saying what they thought. And I do suggest that the IRA insurrection of the 1970s and 80s was a much greater existential threat to this country than anything done by excitable youths in Bradford or Leicester. These people's violent propensities seem to be directed towards one side or the other in a foreign civil war. The IRA supporters in this country wanted to break up the United Kingdom. They wanted to unite part of the United Kingdom to a foreign country and bring about a Marxist revolution in those two joined countries. Indeed, they probably wanted to bring down our own system of government. The Irish Solidarity Campaign was a much greater existential threat to this country than Islam for UK or any of the other organisations with which Anjem Choudhury may be associated.
Yep. I just wanted to problematize the distinction between speech and fundraising a little bit, because most speech in the modern world, at least for most advocacy, requires some expenditure of funds. If you want to print out pamphlets or on the website or produce videos, and how different is that from fundraising on someone's behalf?
You'd apply the rules of criminal liability to this. Let's suppose that you want to run a blog which upholds the right of violent jihad against the unbelievers. Then yes, you should have the right to raise funds and you should have the right to run your blog arguing for violent jihad against the unbelievers. If, on the other hand, your blog then starts an appeal to buy Semtex for young persons to blow themselves up in the Leicester Central branch of Starbucks, well, then Inspector Plod should come and start asking a few questions. But, you know, there are grey areas all around that, so that's just the general rule.
Okay, Peter?
Just at the beginning you said things have got to such a bad situation that academics are being asked to sit in on these discussions. I just want to reassure you that I am not that person. I am an academic here, but on the contrary, I'm here partly because I'm a supporter of free speech and particularly concerned about the condition of it at the London School of Economics, which has probably won a recent prize for being the worst university from that point of view. And Peter asked me to, amongst other people, asked if I would chair the meeting because the school had asked him that you should get an external academic to chair the meeting. And I refused, saying I didn't think it was, because I believe in free speech, I shouldn't be regulating your speech. I would be as the academic policeman in that situation. And I was at a meeting, I'm coming to a question, I was at a meeting discussion for university administrators about the prevent strategy. At which a vice chancellor of the London University said, "Oh, I don't want against free speech. I want everybody to be able to say whatever they want on my campus, because I want them to say it on my campus I don't want them going back to Wembley or Whitechapel and talking about it there. I'd much rather they were talking about it on my campus, where I know who's saying what, in circumstances that I can manage or something like that. And similarly, the LSE seems concerned that even a meeting like this, but certainly a meeting that might involve ideas in the jihadi line, it's not so much they want to stop people saying things, but they want to control the form in which it's said, there needs to be balance, a neutral chair, and all of that. So I wonder what you thought about that. That it's not so much a negative, repressive intervention. It's a regulative, enabling kind of intervention that I think is imagined in the prevent strategy.
Yeah.
Whether that's a problem.
Okay. Well, for the avoidance of doubt, although I have no right to determine who is present at this meeting, I regard your presence here as both welcome and friendly. And I do wear more than one hat. I am the director of the Libertarian Alliance, and I am also, in some respects, an educator. And I'm aware of, not necessarily of legal requirements as yet, but I'm aware of very strong administrative pressures on me to monitor and to record certain utterances or certain likely utterances by my students and to make these available to my superiors. So this has been a requirement in my sector for many years now, and so far it has been regarded as a mildly scandalous joke. It has been largely ignored, but the insistence is becoming more pressing. And sooner or later, I can see that I shall be pushed to the point where if I'm standing in a lecture room waiting for people to finish coming in, and I hear a certain conversation behind me, I shall have to turn and say, would you please desist from this line of conversation, otherwise I shall be legally required to report you to the administration of our institution. Now, we are not there yet, but I can see that we're moving in that direction. I can also see, I'm also aware of all of these requirements to promote British values and to argue against the various kinds of heresy or dissent from these British values. It is all deplorable, and so far I and my colleagues have done the absolute minimum, but I can see that as with the progress of the money laundering regulations, minimal compliance, i.e. non-compliance, will be gradually phased out, and full and indeed over-compliance will soon become the norm, at which point I and many other people will need to reconsider our positions.
Yeah. Kind of a joint question, saying, with regard to your position, quite simply, you care about freedom of speech, concerned about it on campus, and with regard to the specific example you gave, where you say you feel we're moving in a direction whereby you may overhear a conversation and be obliged to report it. The question is, what should academics be doing? What do they want to do? What should academics be doing in order to improve the free speech environment, particularly on campus, particularly on campuses in general, with regard to LSE in particular, but with regard to campuses in general? And are there any hesitations which academics may have for speaking out against a lack of free speech, or speaking to improve the environment of free speech on campus?
I don't know. What do you think?
Do you feel academics have anything that there are things academics should be doing in order to improve the state of free speech on campuses?
Yes, of course there are, but you see, we all have jobs and pensions to think about, and even if jobs and pensions are not at stake, we have reputations and friendships to think about. And am I really going to stick my neck out in defence, am I going to stick my professional neck out in defence of somebody who may be mentally unbalanced, may not be a very nice person, whose opinions I personally may find disagreeable, and whom under normal circumstances I'd walk by on the other side of the street? It really does come down to that. The problem with restrictions on freedom of speech is that the people who are caught by those are usually, in the general sense, undesirables. You see, all other people shut up when the laws come in. It's the undesirables who stand up and give spittle-flecked speeches in defence of whatever has been banned.
Can't believe you've just said that. Come on.
No, I am saying that. Look, if it were to, let me think. I believe that most claims about anthropogenic global warming are lies put out in defence of well-funded special interest groups, which includes official bodies. I can say that because there is no law against saying that. If we were to have a climate change denial or hate speech law, I would shut up about it. I would just think it isn't true, but I'm not going to say it. The people left arguing against the consensus position would be the people who at the moment are regarded as a bit strange. You see, that is what happens with censorship. If you are an anti-censorship advocate, you are repeatedly obliged to defend people whose presence at any meeting is an embarrassment. Look, back in the 1950s and 60s, most of the people standing up and saying, I'm a homosexual and I believe in rights for homosexuals, were what's called, they were people of rather ill repute. The great mass of shop assistants and assistant librarians and parking wardens who might have had an inclination to all male sex, they just kept their heads down. And if you criminalise anything that shouldn't be criminalised, if you criminalise any opinion, the people left standing in defence of it are the oddballs. And that's what is partly so bad about it.
Peter,
Well, just to give an answer, I think there are two. I'll come back to what Steve said. I think there's two ways of expressing it. One is to think about what academics should do in relation to the university, what we do, and the other is what we should do in relation to what students do. And that's much, and in a way that's trickier because somebody may remember the atheist T-shirt round, the student unions, so that whole thing, and I don't know if the two atheists, there was an atheist society, student society, and they had Jesus and Mo T-shirts, which offended the diversity of student university officers, so she got them kicked out, and they were threatened. Well, she got them kicked out in the freshest fair, but then they were threatened, seriously threatened, by the university administration. Now, at that point, I didn't intervene, but should have done. I thought at that moment I should have written a letter to the school secretary saying, this is a mistake, you shouldn't be doing this, back off, which they did eventually, because it was a mistake. But then a year later, around comes the homophobia, the rugby and homophobia round, so the whole round of the rugby homophobia, and there I'm forced now, because it's a much bigger deal, to speak up for people I don't have any sympathy for at all. I just have no sympathy for them. So then, and in fact, tactically, I would have been wiser to intervene very publicly where I did have some sympathy with the atheists, because then I'm stuck, as a number of us were in the law department, fighting and then having an argument about policy. Now again, insofar as it's something that happens in the student union, my view is we should have nothing to do with it because students should organise their own political life, their own discussions, that should be, and we shouldn't be policing it. But once it became a question of what the school was going to do, then it becomes a matter of my responsibility. And there I think that policy was a disaster, and we gave reasons why. There were only 10 of us, and the administration didn't take a lot of interest. But I mean, it took some interest. We got a little, thanks to the law department, we don't need to problem. So that, I think there's a difference between what you do in student life and because we shouldn't be doing that. Well, that's difficult. I had that problem with Peter. I'm thinking, I'm here because I thought, well, I want a meeting on free speech to happen. Even if I don't agree with everything you say, I want you to, you know, that's the point. But I don't want to make it happen by being the policeman who. So that's the tricky thing. But I agree with you on that. That was exactly how our experience was, that because I didn't actually say anything on the atheists, I ended up having to pile in on people I really didn't agree with. But you've got to do it, and that was difficult. You know, the truth is that in the law department, very few. I know of quite a few people, academics, who were sympathetic but weren't willing to put their heads above the parapet. Some of us were. But so that's one of the second thing. Perhaps it's a question for you as well. It does seem to me, I agree with you, there's a culture of fear, but it seems to be driven by weakness. The whole thing is driven by weakness. The campaign for censorship is in itself driven by an incapacity to make the argument. It's only people who can't make the argument against homophobia or sexism or racism, whatever it is, who want to ban the speech they disagree with. So it's driven by a weakness. So do you think if you're willing to stand up and mock it and set it up and show it for what it's, you know, it is possible. But that's like any cultural thing. The only way to define it is to do what Peter's actual did.
Yes.
Whatever anybody's views on that question, to get up and fight it.
Yeah. But none of us is Peter Tatchell. You know, if there was the slightest chance that security persons would burst into this room and manhandle me out or off the university premises and kick me onto the pavement, I would simply not have been here tonight.
I feel there is a slightest chance of that. It's being honest. Come on,
I'm sure even LSE would not.
No, but the point is that.
Well, can I just? Well, I mean, that is more or less what happened to the atheist students, which we did. They were removed from this precious fair by security, and all their stuff was thrown over the board. So you know, it's not beyond.
No, I'm not willing to do anything that involves the possibility of a violent response to me. Also, another point worth considering is that we do have these disclosure and barring service checks nowadays, and I have an absolutely clean one. I've never been convicted, I've never been charged, I've never been arrested or cautioned, I've never been spoken to adversely by the police. And the thought that the police would come and drag me out of the room and dress me down for having said undesirable things fills me with professional dread. I just can't afford to do it. And so cowardice does come into this. To stand up to people demanding censorship requires a great deal more courage than I've ever shown. I will stand up to them, but only because they are not yet sufficiently powerful to shut down the mere expression of a belief in freedom of speech. But I do feel we're moving towards that.
And do you have any advice as to what we as students can do? Because obviously we're generally, I guess we do have our university places to think about, but it's not quite the same thing in terms of jobs and pensions, which you mentioned. You might know there's recently been a free speech society set up here. You know, is it a good idea for us to you know, invite people as a kind of provocative thing to challenge these people, or should we simply set out the arguments for freedom of speech?
I think the latter. Let's think of the most. Okay, what you could do is set up a freedom of speech society, and you could run a series of events in which you invited people like Anjem Choudhury, David Irving.
That was a suggestion, right?
Is Myra Hindley still alive? Dennis Nielsen, he's still alive. You could try to get him to speak by a video link of some kind. No, you could do that. You'd get acres of newspaper publicity, and you get the BBC, but it really wouldn't do. It wouldn't do you much good. I'm afraid the best any of us can do at the moment is to put the case against censorship in the abstract and to try to counter specific demands for censorship. That may work in the long term, I don't know, but I would certainly never suggest that other people should go out of the way to do the things that I would be frightened to do myself. All political movements of any kind are filled with what somebody once called the "why don't you" merchants. Why don't you chain yourself to the railings of 10 Downing Street and swallow the key? This would really raise the profile of our cause. Oh no, I'm not doing it, but you do it, you do it. No. I'm not a "why don't you" merchant. I wouldn't put myself into serious trouble. I don't expect you to do so.
Probably got time for a couple more questions. Anything else to say? I've got one more question myself there. Yeah, in your speech you said about how the kind of mentality of censorship from people who have sort of they kind of rely on the government to restrict things which they think, I think you use the example of fat people, and they think, oh, I can't deal with people, making jokes or whatever about being fat, therefore we should go to the government to make some hate speech law. Do you think that's kind of part of a broader kind of growing status mentality in society, that we rely on the government to basically solve our problems?
Yes. What I would say generally, however, is that there never has been a time in this country or in any other where freedom of expression was generally respected. There are certain things you cannot easily say today which you could say 50 years ago. Equally, there were many things 50 years ago you couldn't talk about that you can nowadays, or indeed that you are nowadays required to say. And so to say that there is a rising tide of intolerance may be true, but on the other hand it may be an optical illusion. You don't see how restrictive speech was in the past. Indeed, here is a point which is worth considering. There are nowadays many laws, against expressing certain opinions. There are also what amount to laws, though they're not written as such on the statute book, and these are all utterly deplorable. At the same time, although you were perfectly at liberty 40 years ago, 40, 50, 30, 25 years ago to say these things, nobody was able to listen to you when you said them, whereas nowadays anybody can have an audience of millions. You don't have to send an article off to a newspaper and expect it to be put into a bin or published, if at all, ruthlessly butchered. You don't have to beg somebody to publish a letter in a newspaper or try to turn up in front of television cameras with a banner saying George Davis is innocent, to go back to a time when I was rather young. Nowadays, you just start your blog or start your Twitter feed or open your Facebook account, and you can go viral. And so, although we live in a more repressive environment in the legal and administrative sense, in practical terms, we have greater freedom of speech today than we've ever had in my lifetime, and maybe at any time in history.
Okay. Any final points? Okay, well, please join me in thanking Sean Gabb for talking to us. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much.
And may